perspectives, considering multiple aspects of an issue and why they are present, looking at an issue from different angles, thinking about what isn't being said as well as what is being said, analyzing and evaluating, analyzing and interpreting. Good. So I've got a couple of definitions from my research. Good reasoning, judgment, taking a rational approach, argument analysis skills, clarifying, defining the question, asserting the credibility of sources, problem solving, decision making, and creative thinking. It consists of seeing both sides of an issue, being open to new evidence that disconfirms your ideas, reasoning dispassionately, demanding that claims be backed by evidence, deducing and inferring conclusions from available facts, solving problems, and so forth. It requires us to use our imagination, seeing things from perspectives other than our own, and envisioning the likely consequences of our position. Okay. So let's try and put this into practice. I've got an example here of what I want you to do. Think of an assumption that you have about critical thinking. So for example, one might assume that critical thinking is only for academics and for university level students. The reason that they might have this assumption is because as language teachers, they believe that their job is just to teach language and nothing else, and they do not need to get into critical thinking because students will eventually be able to master this through university. So take a minute or two and think of an assumption that you have. I'm really interested to know what your assumptions about critical thinking might be. So if you could put those in chat along with a reason. People think you need a high proficiency to express your critical thoughts. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. Any more assumptions? A couple seconds more. If we expect students to accept what we tell them uncritically, then we are not encouraging them to be critical thinkers. If you're not taught critical thinking in school, you won't do it. Okay, so try and remember those assumptions that you just posted. And if you haven't posted, try and think about it as we go through. And at the end of the session, we will come back to the assumption that you had and your reason for it. Here are some fun facts about critical thinking. It is subject specific and depends on background knowledge. You need a college degree and a high IQ to be able to think critically. It is a negative process, meaning it is to criticize, and 3-year-olds are critical thinkers. Some of these are true and some of these are false. Think about which ones are true and which ones are false and put it in chat, please. Just the number and then true or false. Okay. More answers are coming. Okay. So let's look at it then. Critical thinking is subject specific. This is actually true. The more subject knowledge or the more background knowledge you have, the wider your perspective will be, and how well you can interpret what you hear or what you read depends on your background knowledge. Willingham writes about this in detail, and as an example, he gives this, you read an article, a sort of a newspaper article that discusses some sort of copyright war between China and America. As you read, when you look at the word Bush in the article, you would know from background knowledge that that refers to the former president, George W. Bush. And you would know that it is not, it does not mean, a small plant. And if you think about it, in reading lessons, when we teach English, we do this with students a lot. We try and give them some sort of background knowledge, some background information. We spend time sort of scaffolding. So that when they go into the reading, they are then able to use their contextual knowledge and their background knowledge to read better. And so the same is sort of applicable to critical thinking. So yeah, this is true. And you cannot really be very successful at critical thinking if you don't have enough background knowledge. So if a student is asked to look at two sides of an issue, they are not going to be able to do it necessarily if they do not have enough information to sort of, for each side of an issue. Okay, so so this is true. You need a college degree and a high IQ to be able to think critically. This is not true. For me, when I first started having to engage critically with texts at university level, I thought that this was the case because there were times when I was very frustrated about not being able to do it, and I wondered if I could do it or not. Plus, at university level, you don't get a lot of guidance. You just have things to read, and it's about practice. Also in school, I wasn't really taught to think critically. And so I thought that you sort of begin to think that, maybe you're not smart enough or not intelligent enough to think critically. But as we will find out as we go through this presentation, there are ways, sort of models that you can use to help you think critically. It's sort of about knowing what critical thinking is. Critical thinking is a negative process. Again, for me, I used to think that it meant to criticize. So you read an article and you look at the flaws. You try and basically see what you disagree with the author. But I learned through practice that critical thinking is not about finding the flaws or looking at things negatively. It's really about assessing how valid and accurate something is. So we might find some of it narrow, we might disagree with some things, we might think that some things are not accurate, but at the same time, we would still be able to learn from it, we would still be able to appreciate what is good in it while noticing what is lacking in the text. And the fourth one, this is true, and I think most of you said this is true. For me personally, I think that when kids ask a lot of questions, they are put down by grown-ups around them, and school does not necessarily encourage, critical thinking questions or just, asking questions. And I think this is a shame, really. I think that kids sort of tend to lose it as they go through life, lose sort of being able to think critically. Hooks, and I think someone quoted from something that Hooks has written in chat, but Hooks argues that critical thinking comes from a desire to know more, sort of from that inquisitiveness, and this is really what we see in children. All right, so how do we teach critical thinking in the context of race? So this can be applied, of course, how we teach critical thinking can be applied, of course, generally, but since we're talking about race and racism, I'm trying to keep it within that context. So there's 3 steps, really. The first is to know what critical thinking skills and rules are. And I've got this model from Brookfield. There's so many models out there, and so many ways to look at it, and so many steps that you can take, stages. But I think I find Brookfield's really simple and straightforward, and very easy to apply in class. So his first step is hunting assumptions. So basically, every action that we do is based on an assumption. So I want you to think about it for a little bit. I'll give you an example of what I'm asking you to do. If you're a person that suffers from mental health problems and you are being told or advised by your friends and family to do therapy, and you choose not to do therapy, your action is rejecting the idea of therapy. And your assumption is that it won't work. So I want you to take a minute. You don't have to share this on chat because I understand that it can be personal, but think of an action that you do and the assumption that that action is based on, just so you're able to apply this process to yourself. I'm looking at chat just in case, but I'll move on in a couple of seconds. Okay, so it's fine if you haven't shared, but I hope that you have come up with an action that you do and the assumption that it is based on. The second thing that you need to do is check your assumptions. So here you're basically asking yourself, are your assumptions reliable? Are they accurate? Are they backed by evidence? Where did they come from? Did they come from experience? Did they come from authority? So do you have these assumptions because you were taught these assumptions by parents, teachers, whatever it is? And try and apply these questions to the assumption that you came up with when we looked at hunting assumptions. Okay, but before we go on to 3 and 4, I want you to think of ideas for activities. So when you teach students critical thinking, I think it's important to get them to go through these stages so that they can apply it to themselves before you go into getting them to applying it to different subjects. So I'd like you to come up with some ideas for activities on how you can get students to hunt their assumptions and check their assumptions. Please put your ideas on chat. Yes, thinking time. Yeah, I can give you about a minute for thinking time. But I am quite interested in what you all might come up with. When I say activities, though, I don't mean sort of elaborate activities. I mean, for example, you might get students to reflect on certain prejudices that they have. Yes, Bonnie. The question was basically, how could you get students to hunt and check their assumptions in the classroom? in the context of a story text, we could ask students what they guess about the characters and ask them why they have made those guesses. Yes, that's a good idea. Doing word association activity to then build up to what assumptions we have. Getting students to consider and refute stereotypical views. Yes. Activities to think about and become aware of how unconscious bias could affect their assumptions. Yes. Some really good ideas. So like I said, you might get students to reflect on prejudices they have. For example, you might get them to think about how they treat their housemates, or what goes through their mind when they see a member of a minority or minoritized group, how they feel a certain group is represented in the media, and if they agree with this representation or if they disagree with it. Okay. I think I have a couple more ideas coming, which I do want to look at. Ask who the authors are and why they may believe them. We could show part of a picture, gradually revealing more that would reveal unexpected layers. I think that's a cool, fun idea. Riddles, showing part of a video. This is the same as images, showing a picture of a group of people around a table, asking students to identify their relationships. Yes. So going on to the third step, and this is seeing things from different viewpoints. So at this point, you want to ask yourself a question like, do people see what you want them to see? So when you act a certain way, are you communicating what you're aiming to communicate with your action? And then finally, taking informed actions. And I think that this is really the crux of it. I mean, this is what we want to achieve when we get our students to become critical thinkers. We want them to be independent-minded enough and aware enough to challenge and counter the norms that they see in their society, and take action, to work towards something more positive. So that's Brookfield's 4 things, which I think are quite cool. We also want to think about teaching multicultural awareness. And so I took this from Sue. And so multicultural awareness, there's 3 areas to consider: awareness, knowledge, and skills. Awareness is knowing what our beliefs and attitudes are, and how our beliefs and attitudes come from previous learning. So this is basically about knowing our identity in the society that we live in, knowing the identity of the other in the society that we live in or in the community, and then being able to understand where the attitudes we have towards our identities and where the attitudes we have towards the other identities come from. And sort of being able to place it within, the social and political system that we live in. Knowledge is to understand, the second one, knowledge is to understand perspectives. So you want to ask questions like, why do I have these feelings about this particular group? What feelings does that group have about my, my racial group? What systems are in place that promote or sort of solidify, the negative stereotypes that people might have? Where do these systems come from? Are they as old as colonization? What is the impact of these systems on the lives of people, around me and on my life? And that's really what knowledge is about. And then the last one is skills. So this is basically, this kind of goes along with taking informed action. So behaving appropriately with others. And here you would ask yourself questions like, how do I treat a certain group of people? Why do I treat them this way? Do I have stereotypes that are sort of working towards how I treat certain groups of people? What have my encounters with these with certain groups of people been like, and what has the impact of my behavior on them been? So those are really the 3 stages. And I hope that these 3 stages and the 4 stages that I just showed you before give you an idea of how to approach critical thinking in the classroom with your students. So those are the skills and the rules that you need to think about. And then after that, it's about doing it practically. So how are the students going to use these skills in the classroom? Now I've got Paul and Elder's 8 elements of thought here. Purpose, question at issue, information, interpretation and inference, concepts, assumptions, implications and consequences, and point of view. And I've got some questions here. Let's just go here. So you've got the question, and in blue are the things that you want to think about. Paul and Elder, 2016, they have a really nice sort of mini booklet. It's a guide on how to think critically. And they've got lots of stuff there that you can apply to your classroom teaching. For each of these in blue, they've got a couple of questions, not just one. And I've just put one question for each here as an example. Take a couple of seconds to read that. Okay, I was just reading the chat messages while you were doing that. Some interesting stuff. So going on, after you've identified the skills and the rules, and you've identified how to use these skills, you then need to infuse critical thinking into course content, right? And I've got an example here of how I did this one time. Again, I took this from Paul and Elder. It's a template on analyzing the logic of the name of an article. I know you can't read this very well, but these questions are based basically on these. Okay, so when I did this with my students, they read an article about the dangers of addiction. And so what I got them to do, and this was at their level because it was their course book that had this article. So what I got them to do was read the article and then analyze it and then answer these questions to basically answer this question: how logical is the name of the article? I did this after this. I did a couple of activities with them over maybe 3 to 6 hours. I had them for 3 hours at a time, so it was quite easy to spend a lot of time, talking about it. I had them read narratives of people who were once alcoholic, who knew someone on drugs, a doctor who wrote about addictions on a personal blog. So I got them to read those, and I got them to analyze those articles, looking at the different perspectives, identify the assumptions that the writer or the speaker, was making, think of reasons for the assumptions, think of questions to ask the writer. And then finally, I got them to do their own writing around the topic of addictions. And I went into some really detailed, writing with them. So got them to do their research, got them to, present arguments, argue for the arguments, provide evidence, data, and so on and so forth. Once they had done that, I got them to then ask questions about their own writing. So I came up with some sort of template, again, based on the 8 elements of thought from Paul and Elder. And I got them to look at their own writing and reflect on it. And I thought it was quite useful, and they were really into it. So that was a lesson that I did on addictions, but I think that the very same could be applied to the subject of racism. So you could get them to read personal narratives. You could get them to read articles about racism, articles about discrimination in society, news reports, and so on and so forth. We're going to look at a couple more practical examples later. But first, I've got two more fun facts for you. Sorry. And which ones which ones are true and which ones are false? Thank you, Bonnie, for sharing that. Post your answers in chat, please. So number 1 and number 2. A couple more seconds. Okay. So critical thinking is something teachers need to model too. This is definitely true. And most of you think it's true, or those of you who have put your answers in chat. It's definitely something teachers need to model. In my context, I think it's fair to say that sometimes that's the only example that they're going to get. So you modeling it might be the only opportunity they have to see someone actually doing it, see someone actually asking, you know, the right questions and so on and so forth. So it's very necessary for teachers to model it. And I would consider it much the same way as anything else. Like if you want to show them a concept in class, you model it to them. And with critical thinking, the modeling is necessary, along with, you know, some guided instruction. The second one, I think, so Tyson was unsure, Irene was also unsure, and Bonnie was also unsure. And that's rightly so, because this is actually true and false. So group work has lots of positives. You can share ideas. You can get students to question what the other is saying. You can get them to you know, counter argue. You can get them to ask for clarification. You can get them to work together and collaborate to achieve an understanding of something. So group work is very important for critical thinking. But Brookfield warns against something called groupthink. Does anyone want to guess what groupthink is, or has anyone heard of groupthink before? Any yeses, nos, reactions? Right. So groupthink is essentially when everyone sort of just accepts something to be the truth because that's what the majority is saying, and there's no questioning of it. So they don't really ask questions. They don't think about, you know, where does this come from? Do I have any Orwell fans in my audience today? Anyone read 1984? Yes, I I wouldn't be surprised if we all have. It's definitely a good book and well worth reading. Doublethink is Orwell's way of putting it, and it's pretty much the same as groupthink. It's the same concept that we sort of all just follow a norm because that's what everyone's doing, and our critical thinking is totally turned off. All right. So here I've got 4 examples of activities that you can do in class. I took these from Brookfield, and in the next couple of slides, I have other examples for each of these activities. So your task now is, we've got question and answers, scenario analysis, real life simulation, chalk talk. Your task now is to read what I have on my slide, the activity description, and decide which activity it goes with. Put your answer in chat, please. Okay, and the answer for this is scenario analysis. Okay. I've got some other examples here, so you can get them to read a newspaper report about a hate crime and then answer these questions. Mass persecution of a group of people is something that they can read about as well, or study about, and also read about the abuse of a low-wage worker. So these are lots of different sort of topics within the subject of racism that you can bring into the classroom and get them to analyze those scenarios. Okay, next one. This is Chalk Talk. So this can really work with any question, right? So here are some questions that I had. Does anyone here know Benjamin Zafanya? Have you read his work? So he's a really cool person to look up. He wrote a poem called The British Poem, and there's a performance of it as well. Yes, James, he's great. And I've used the British poem a couple of times in my lessons with different levels, and got them to like look at it, and we studied it a little bit. So you can maybe ask a question like, what message is Zafanya trying to send in the British poem? Who knows Banksy? I'm sure someone's heard of him here. So you could get them to look at Banksy's work, and then ask this question: do you think that his work actually changes anything? And he's done some pretty amazing stuff if you look him up, which will really blow your minds. So getting students to like look at all the stuff that people have written and all the stuff that people have done, I think can also inspire them to do things on their own. So this is like one way to do it, and then get them to think about what is out there. We should all be making an effort to help persecuted minority groups is the third example that I have there. Okay, next one. So this is real life simulation. Thank you for the suggestion on the poem by Lawrence. So here are my other examples. Students see someone being wrongfully arrested. What can or should they do? Students recognize racist stereotypes in popular music and think of actions they can take. I think this one's quite important because students and the youth are really exposed a lot to music and movies. And I think that it would be really useful for them to be able to actually listen to what is being said, rather than just sort of blindly, liking things. Students think about how to help a peer that is being bullied for their race. And here's the last one. So this is obviously questions and answers. Get them to think of a problem in the community, and they can then think of responses to the problem and the assumptions that led them to the responses. I would say that this is a little challenging to do maybe. So, but after students have spent some time working around critical thinking and have enough background knowledge, as we said earlier, it's definitely doable. Here are some other examples. Students might focus on a smaller aspect of a bigger problem, such as a rise in hate crimes within their community as part of a national trend. They might focus on the growing popularity of an influencer who is promoting harmful stereotypes. And I mean, we see this a lot. We see a lot of famous people or celebrities making the news for, all sorts of things. And if we don't talk to our youth about it, really who is, right? So I think it's important that we consider this. Students might consider ways to address a lack of conversation about racism within their community. This is another problem as well that we have, or we might have in some communities. we don't talk about race, or we don't talk about racism. We don't talk about the discrimination of certain groups of people. They are totally sidelined in every way. So to get students to sort of think about this as well. All right, so the last thing that I want you to do is, if you remember at the start, you made an assumption about critical thinking. I want you to, you don't have to share this with me, but I want you to revisit your assumption, reflect on whether you have changed your mind about it since we started and as we went through the presentation. And write down some questions that you might have about it that you can then go and look for answers for. And that will be a really good critical thinking exercise for you. Okay, here are my resources. I specifically suggest reading Willingham and reading Brookfield. I found Brookfield's book really, really useful. And also Paul and Elder's booklet really useful. And Willingham's work was just really interesting. Okay. That's the end of my session. If we have time for questions, please feel free. I don't know.
There's one in the
Tyson
chat
would need to. How do you deal with a student or students whose views are pronouncedly different from where you are trying to take your class? This is a really good question, and I have to admit that I haven't experimented very much with this, because in my context, there's not much discussion in sort of society about the racism that is happening here. But I do know that Brookfield discusses this in his book. So definitely read that. Yeah, okay. Tyson has allowed room for questions. So if anyone has any, please feel free.
If anybody wants to turn on their mic and ask a question orally and out loud, you can do that too.
Catalin, I think one needs to be prepared. Definitely, one does need to be prepared, I think. I think part of it is knowing your students first, I think, is very important. And knowing like how much sort of leeway you have with, you know, bringing these discussions into the classroom, knowing your students' cultural background and their political background as well, because you don't want, you know, parents coming into class the next day and being like, you shouldn't have brought that up. But I think that if you want to approach it safely, you can work on just critical thinking at first. And that would really open up their minds to, you know, accepting other perspectives, and then maybe accepting the sort of the discussion of race in the classroom. It's definitely not something that, you know, you can't just like pick it up and go into class. It's not that kind of lesson. It takes a lot of experience and a lot of background work to be able to do it. Thank you, Bill, for sharing. Peter's question. Yes, I do find that a lot of students find thinking critically difficult. And I mean, to be honest, when I was in school, the idea was totally like new for me. I mean, I would not have even dared to look into it. There was no such thing. There was no such thing as, you know, asking questions. So they do, and I think it's very sad. I think it is. I mean, it's something that as teachers we need to allow them to do. We need to give them opportunities to do it. You know, because I feel like that's really our only hope of making the world a better place, or of combating racism, if we're talking about this context. So yeah. I think that might be the last of the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Just to finish up, I just want to say thank you to all of you for participating, for attending. and your really great ideas and your input.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And for the rest of you, remember that you can donate as per your request. And our next session will be by the hour.
Great. I'd like to thank you too, Zahra. It's been an insightful session, and I'm very happy that and pleased that you were part of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
For everybody else, we have about an 11-minute break now. So you can go get a coffee or do what you need to do, and then you can join either tent A, which is where we are, or go to tent B. And whoops, I'm looking at the wrong one. And so for session C, tent A is the forum with Ila Combra and Chris Richards, and tent B is Emma Halliday. So we'll see you at the hour.
Hi, Chris.
Now you can hear me. Hi, James.
Hi, how's it going?
Very well, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, good, thank
Hi,
you.
Chris. Nice to see you in person.
You are. Yeah.
Yeah.
James, can you
The
stop
thing is-
recording, please?
Yeah.
And can you turn on my camera, James? Because you have turned it
yeah,
off.
I turned you
No, I
off.
cannot do it on my own.